Speaker is Brant Gardner. Brant's academic background includes work towards a PhD in Mesoamerican ethnohistory at the State University of New York, Albany. His published works on Mesoamerica include an analysis of classical, and I remember reading his bio last year. I can never pronounce any of these words. Read the book, he said. Just read the book. Nahuatl kinship terminology, an ethnohistoric investigation into the identification of the use of Mesoamerican languages. So I'll go to that. With that, you can read the rest of the bio in your program. Brant Gardner has been a favorite speaker of ours. He's spoken many times, and his books seem to be very popular. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Brant Gardner.
I confess that I've been more afraid of doing this one than I have any other presentation I've done, and that's because we're talking about topics that we tend not to talk about or we get somewhat embarrassed about in the church. We're going to talk about sear stones today. We don't like to talk about sear stones. We like to talk about the Urim and Thummim, and there's a good reason why we talk about the Urim and Thummim, but we try not to call the Urim and Thummim a sear stone. It sounds so much more elegant if we call it the Urim and Thummim. So that's kind of the problem and the basis that we're looking at. What I want to talk about is the process of translating the Book of Mormon. Brother Brown started that process for us this morning, and I was kind of encouraged by some of the questions, because some of the questions that were asked of him are some of the ones that I really like to try and answer. And that, of course, makes me nervous, because what we really want to see if we can do is talk about how sear stones work and how you would translate with one. And believe it or not, we're going to come up with a theory of how that's going to work. All right. First, what I'm not talking about. Kind of have to begin with that because, as Scott had mentioned, we had for a little while a book for sale out there, and it's coming again at some point in time. So this is a topic that I've written, a book about, and there's no way that in this amount of time we're going to be able to talk about everything that we tried to cover in the book, so there's certain things that you can't cover. One of the things that I didn't put on the slide that is, however, very important, one of the things that I couldn't cover the book and I'm not going to cover now is a very important preliminary question to this entire issue of how was the Book of Mormon translated? And that is that the question of how the Book of Mormon was translated is completely moot unless it was translated. So the very first issue that we really ought to know about is, can we say that the Book of Mormon was translated? And neither here nor in the book will I actually address that. I start off in the book and I said, nope, we're just going to take that as a given. So you have to take that as a given right now. Now, I will also tell you that it's a given based on information that I've already researched, and I have my reasons for having the security of knowing that the Book of Mormon is a translated ancient document. So I've seen the evidence. It just isn't what we're going to talk about now. Now that we have a book that's a translation, what do we do with it? Well, the kinds of things that we're not going to do with it is, I'm not going to talk about the stories of translation. There's a lot of interesting things there. How is it that the sear stone became a Urim and Thummim? Those are things that I'm looking at in the book, but again, we're in a short period of time. We've got to get to the fun stuff. The next one I don't want to spend too much time on, but I do have to mention a little bit. What kind of translation was it? So we have the question of, is it a translation that we're going to table for the moment? But then the question becomes, what kind of translation? For those of you who've read anything that people have talked about the nature of the translation of the Book of Mormon, there's all kinds of theories of what the relationship of our English text might have been to the text on the gold plates. One of the concepts is that it's a literal, word-for-word, very, very close translation. For those of you who are familiar with work that Royal Skousen's done, this is probably closest to what he would call an ironclad type. Well, actually, it's kind of back from that. he has this concept of an ironclad translation that says it's just absolutely dictated and absolutely controlled, and he said, that the evidence shows that that's not there. I would call that an inerrant translation and totally agree with him that the evidence is that we don't have an inerrant, perfect, God-breathed translation. Something else happened. What I found as I was looking through the definitions of what kind of translation it might be, I found that the schema that Skousen had come up with wasn't particularly useful, because what he defined as a tight translation, that I would probably say is literal, his actual definition talked about the dictation, not the translation. And we really want to get to the translation. I want to talk about the relationship of the text in English to the text on the plates, not the text that Joseph spoke. And so I had to go somewhere else. So what I'm looking at is 3 different ways of translating that are all legitimately used modes of translation, each of which moves slightly farther away from its source text. So the literal one is the one that comes the closest to the source text. The functional translation is one that says, I'm following the text, but the vocabulary will be slightly different and modified. The syntax might be modified so that somebody else would understand it, but in general it's going to follow very closely without being a word-for-word literal translation. And the last one, a conceptual translation, is one where you say, for instance, an idiom. I have to translate this idiom. What does it mean to be in hot water? If I translate that literally, I'm going to get it wrong. So I have to translate it in some way that conveys the information, even though I'm getting farther and farther away from the words. And in some areas of a conceptual translation, that might even drift a little bit farther away. So having said that, I can't remember what my next slide is. Okay, not that. Let's go back. When I first started looking at the evidence to try and tell me what kind of translation we had in the Book of Mormon, my operating assumption, based on everything that I had seen before, was that I was pretty convinced from what I had seen that it was a functional translation. And then I started looking back through the data again, and I started finding some things that told me it just wasn't that simple. Now, you've heard Brother Ricks talk about the names and the fact that the names are authentic, ancient names. I have to agree with him. He's right. Not because I did the research. They did it, and they showed it to me, and I said, by golly, you guys are right. Those are authentic, ancient names. That is not a functional translation. That one's pretty literal. And it's literal, and the connections are such that it's non-random. So it's not one where I could say, it just so happened you came up with a word that was similar. Linguists will tell you that there are about a 5% similarity between any 2 languages that are totally unrelated, where you could find a word in one language and a word in another language that really look the same and might even have the same meaning, and the languages aren't related at all. It's just pure happenstance. There's only so many syllables we can pronounce, and every once in a while somebody's going to put them together if you get enough languages together. So one of the options might have been to say that some of these names were pure happenstance. There's too many of them. The correlations are too tight. So for names, there really is evidence that there's a literal translation. However, it's still the majority of the translation that the evidence that I've seen tells me that it's more functional rather than literal. And what that means is it's going to follow the plate text, but the vocabulary will be different. And one of the things that we have to do as we start looking at how the book was translated is to come up with some sort of a theory that will say, here's how it was translated, and here's why names are translated literally, other things are functional. And I've got at least 2 instances where I think there's some conceptual translation in the Book of Mormon, and I think we can talk about what triggered those and how those occurred as well. All right, let's go into the more interesting stuff. What we really do want to talk about are those 2 questions. How does sear stones work, and how do you translate with one? I've been in several conversations with people, and I'm sure you've asked yourself the same kind of thing. Do sear stones work? really hard question to answer because, unfortunately, it's the wrong question. Okay? Do sear stones work? If I really have to answer that question, I have to say, no, sear stones don't work. Sear stone is a rock. We have sear stones. The church still has them. I've seen them. At one point in time, I remember going on Temple Square and going through the museum there, and I saw one. And I looked at it, and I saw a rock. I didn't see a translation. I didn't see anything else. I saw a rock. I can pretty much guarantee you that the vast majority of us, as we would look at that rock, would see a rock. That does not mean that something isn't working because they were looking at the rock, and that's what we have to look at. What we will be looking at is the idea that this whole concept of the sear stone working, it's the sear that's working. And it's the stone that becomes the trigger that allows the sear to do what the sear does. So that's kind of step one, and we'll talk about how that happens. Step two is, of course, once you know how a sear stone works, that isn't necessarily telling us how you translate with one, and so that's the next question is, how do you translate with a sear stone? All right, how do you see in a stone? I won't read this one to you. You can read it. This is from a modern seer, a modern scryer. This is from a guy who actually wrote a book on how to see, how to scry. That's the word that people use for people who look in crystal balls or seer stones or any number of things. And as you can see, there's a number of places where this particular quotation corresponds a lot to what we get for the descriptions of how Joseph Smith used a seer stone. He put them in the crown of his hat and he stuck his head down in there. Now, for those people who think that he might have been reading something like a manuscript that he was hiding in the crown of his hat, how much light did he need? If you're putting your head down in the hat, the purpose of that is to cut out light. And I'm going to have a real hard time seeing anything, and the older I get, the harder it's getting for me to see if there isn't enough light. So if I'm not getting light into my eyes, I'm not seeing something. And here is the secret of sear stones. Sear stones are used in ways that make it so you should not be able to see a thing. And they create a contradiction in that the person explains what they are seeing at a time when they should not be able to see. And that happens with all of the instruments that they use for scrying. So what do you do with the sear stone? You stick it in the hat. That wasn't the only way Joseph used it. Another way that Joseph used it that we have a record of is he held it up to a candle. Think about what happens when you hold a sear stone up to a candle. You have this black dot in the middle and the corona of the light on the outside, and you're disrupting your vision. The Romans used to have a sword, and they'd take the sword, the polished blade of the sword, and they'd glint the sun off of it and stare at the glint of the sun. Okay, that blinds you. So you're not going to see correctly. The ancient Americans used polished obsidian. They would have concave mirrors and would use polished obsidian. First of all, you would see something in it, but if it's concave, again, something is disrupted there. And so although they were used as mirrors, there's something else going on with the reflection that they're seeing. In the Salem witch trials, they all began because there were girls who were trying to find out who they were going to marry, and one of the ways to do that was to see them by dropping an egg white into a glass of water. Well, of course, that's going to occlude the water. You stare through it, and now that's going to mess up your vision. So everything about sear stones says you're messing up your vision. Okay? Everything about sear stones also tells you that the seer saw. So now we've got a problem. How do you see when you can't see? Well, I think that's the next slide, isn't it? There we go. Yeah, that's one of them. Now what we got? Okay. Really important to understand that if we're going to understand how sear stones work, we have to understand a little bit about how the brain operates. Because these things are happening in a very human brain. Every prophet that I'm aware of has been human, no matter how divinely touched, no matter how extra and extraordinarily human they might have been. Human they were. And they had a brain. And that brain functioned in certain ways, and in certain cases, probably in ways that are slightly different but very similar to our own. One of the important things about vision is that we have to understand that vision does not occur in the eyes, vision occurs in the brain. Although light comes into the eyes, we only see what gets transmitted to the brain is only a very small part of the data that actually comes in through the eyes. And then, not only that, but the brain is creating vision. For those of you who know something about the optic nerve, at the very back of the eye, you have an optic nerve, and that optic bundle comes in and attaches to the back of the retina, and it creates a blind spot where we cannot see anything. How many of you know exactly where your blind spot is and see it all the time? Nobody. That's because the brain fills it in. The brain knows how to generate vision so that we see in a place in the brain where technically we can't see. So the brain is capable of generating the image. We do not see because light takes a picture and somebody inside our brain looks at the picture. The brain creates the vision. Sometimes we see less than what's there. There's a wonderful story about a group of psychologists that got together and they went in and took this test. And they're all competing with each other to see who's going to do the best. And it's a real simple one. They said, what we want you to do is I want this group of people to count these 3 players in black as they pass the basketball around. And I want you guys to watch the guys in white as they pass this basketball around. And I want you to count how many times they pass the basketball. And so they go through this whole process and they finish it up and everybody's kind of comparing and somebody's one off and trying to figure out what's happening. And they said at the end of it, they said, okay, now, how many of you saw the gorilla? And they said, what do you mean? Nobody saw a gorilla. He says, what do you mean there was a gorilla? There was no, you say, did you see the gorilla? And they said, no. So they played back the tape. And in the middle of it, the guy walks out in a big gorilla suit, stands there for 1 second, beats on his chest, and walks off, and nobody saw him. But he was there. Because our brain interprets the information coming in and it saw that as irrelevant and said, you don't need that, I won't show it to you. Okay? How does that happen when you're seeing in the brain? Next piece. There are certain people that have a brain structure that sees a little bit differently than many of us do. They can see in pictures. I am not one of them. Apparently there are a few, and in less than the whole population. They have what they call an eidetic memory. Some people have called it a photographic memory, and that's not correct. That's not what it means. But it does mean that people are able to have and hold in their mind a very detailed picture of something so that when they recall it, they can bring up the picture and describe it. And they talk about these people saying, when they describe this mental picture that they are seeing, that their eyes will move like they're scanning the picture, but it's not there. One of the descriptions of one of the men who had this capability, had this fantastic memory, and I'm not suggesting the memory part, but I'm talking about the visual part. He was able, even years later, to be able to tell people out of this grid of numbers, he could give the list down, across, diagonally of the numbers, and somebody had written it down and tested him a couple of years later. And except for a number or two that were poorly written, he got them all right. And they said, well, how did you do that? And he says, it's simple. I just call up the blackboard, I could see it, and I read it off. Now, most of us can't do that. But there are some people whose visual memory is sufficient that they can see a picture and they can read it. And what I'm suggesting is that when Joseph Smith uses a sear stone, his vision is occluded, but he sees in his brain a picture that allows him to describe it in detail that is much more vivid than the rest of us, and that in the descriptions of any time that's in the pre-scientific world, when they don't know how he does this, would say that the sear stone made it happen. Okay. Next thing. Let's see. Close your eyes. Any of you have had a pet cat or a pet dog? Take a look at the back of your eyeballs and, kind of figure out where the spots are, what kind of shape the ears were. Can you do that? And the answer is sure, we all can. We can all call up an image that we can look at, and it's not particularly vivid in many cases. But if somebody says, what shape are a beagle's ears, you call up a picture of a beagle and start looking at it and then describe it. Okay? So we take this memory of things that we have seen and we store it, and we can reverse the process and create a picture when there is nothing coming into our eyes. So the brain can generate an image. How many of you dreamed last night? Yeah, we all did, whether we remembered it or not, right? In your dreams, how many of you actually saw action happening? Now, some people are good. They can dream in color. I have no idea whether I dream in color or not because I'm partially colorblind. I don't even see in color. But what happens is you see things happening. I see stories occurring. My eyes are pretty closed about that time, but I'm seeing something because vision occurs in the brain. So once we know that you can reverse that process, and instead of light coming into the eyes to generate vision, we can have something in the brain that will generate vision that we can see when we cannot see. That's how sear stones work. They all work on the principle that everybody knows who sees that process that you can't see through your eyes, so what you are describing and seeing has to come through some other means. And depending on what culture you're in and when you're there, they'll have a different explanation for how that happens. It was the gods, the spirits. It's something extra. And that mechanism is what starts the process for understanding how Joseph is going to use a sear stone. Now, we have had people who have been scrying and using these methods for thousands of years in every culture around the world. This idea that you would see in a stone or see in a blade or see in a blot of ink or a polished thumbnail, all of those things are recorded. And they happen in multiple cultures, and people know that they see these things. It's not going to be that widespread if it doesn't happen. This is human nature we're talking about. Now, we also know that it's not normal because people see these and they know that they can't do it, but somebody else does. So that process is there. Regardless of that, however, none of them have translated the Book of Mormon, just one. If you take away Mosiah translating the plates, we have only Joseph Smith who ever translated with that method. Go to Mosiah, we got 2. So if nobody else has translated, how do you translate? Okay, more explanations. Now we have to talk about language. Where does language come from? One of the questions that was asked earlier, Brother Brown, is can you think without language? Amazingly, we have a hard time understanding that we can think without language. The problem is, we all do. We all think prior to language. One of the things that Steven Pinker, that I'm quoting up here, mentioned, he said, every one of us have had the experience of saying, oh, that wasn't what I meant to say. We've said something, but whatever came out of our mouths wasn't what we intended. Which means that there has to be a meant to say before it manages to come out of our mouth. And I would suggest that in many cases there is meaning that occurs prior to the time that we can express it. Think of the number of times that people have had spiritual experiences and they know they've had them and that burning has been there and it's been filling their soul and they try to explain it and words fail. That doesn't mean they didn't experience it. That doesn't mean it wasn't real. It means that there is comprehension and understanding that surpasses language, and they haven't been able to translate it. So we have something that occurs before language is generated. In his terms, Pinker calls it mentalese. He said, this is how we think. We think in this pre-language subset. Now, one of the other things that's fascinating is that they're learning, as you see how the brain works, that a lot of what we think occurs below the level of consciousness. So that what will happen is, you'll forget, and again, I'm getting old enough that this happens to me all the time. Somebody says, well, what was the word for that? Or what's, and you go, if you hadn't asked me, I'd have known. I know the answer to that. come back in about an hour or two, and it'll come. And then what happens is you forget about it, and an hour or two later, all of a sudden it goes boing, and you go, oh yeah, I remember that's what the word was, right? You've done this, right? Everybody's done this. That's because the brain keeps working on this thing in the background, doesn't tell us about it, just keeps going. Figures it out, puts everything together, and goes up to the top, and it says, Eureka, I've got it. And you go, oh yeah, I got it. Because there's all kinds of things that occur prior to the level that we're conscious of them. And one of the things he's talking about here is this idea of priming. And they found out that there are people that will actually recognize sentences that they have not read because they contain words or concepts that they have read. So we have a brain that is designed to interact with language and produces language, but language is not its native storage mechanism. It generates language. Put those things together. How is Joseph Smith ever going to translate? How many of you are reasonably, or again in my case, a number of years ago, have been reasonably fluent in more than one language? We should get a whole bunch of foreign missionaries here and a whole bunch of other people that have done it. Now, how many of you who are not reasonably fluent with another language have struggled with the dictionary to translate? Okay? For those of you who are reasonably fluent and have struggled with the dictionary, you know the difference between those two. If I'm struggling with the dictionary, I really don't know that language. And I'm dealing with it on a word-by-word basis. If I know the language, I'm not even thinking about it. I remember one time when I was on my mission, they asked me to translate for this one sister we had. She was French, and all her zone conferences were in English. She didn't speak English as well as she spoke French or Spanish, and so I was supposed to translate the English into Spanish so that she could hear it in Spanish, so that if she needed to, she might translate it into French, but she knew the Spanish well enough so that she didn't have to go through that process. But, when you're translating something live, you don't have a time to think and say, okay, that word is this word, and I should do it this way. And you're concentrating on getting the information across, and you're coming across very quickly. How do you do that? That's called translation. But it isn't translation where you say, this word is that word. Something occurs in your brain that is located in the concept of meaning, and you take that meaning and express it in language. How did Joseph Smith translate? First of all, did he translate? That's the question I said we had to pause it, because there's no way to demonstrate that other than to do what we have, which is the Book of Mormon, and take that text and go through it and say, is that an authentic ancient record? And the answer, I believe, is yes. So therefore he translated. How did he do it? Where did all this information come from? The only explanation I can give you is that God gave it to him in pure understanding. And that pure understanding goes into his brain in the way that we store pure understanding. It goes into the brain in mentalese. How is it then expressed in language? It is expressed in language in the same way that we express mentalese into our language, through the vocabulary, the sentence structures, the idioms to which we have access based on our education. So how is it that the Book of Mormon contains revival language? It's part and parcel of Joseph's brain. It's part of the language he understood. As soon as that's the meaning he's looking for, those words come out. How many of you have ever used a cliche? How many of you know that you shouldn't and do it anyway? Because they come out of your mouth, whether you care about it or not. Even if you don't want to use them, they pop out. Because we have these phrases burned in our brain. They're part of our language. And we hit the meaning and we pop them out, and we don't even know what the heck we said. And it's this long string of things. And we say it exactly the same way. Because that language, that meaning, triggers that string, and we're going to pop out that whole string. So how does Joseph get that language? It was part and parcel of his brain. Of course he's going to do it that way. But the understanding comes from that which God gave him. Now, I'm getting through with this way faster than I thought I was going to. You better have a lot of questions. We need to start pulling a whole bunch of things together here. Andrew Lang was kind of an interesting anthropologist at the turn of the century. Actually, I've got to go back a century because we've turned another one since then. So, into the 1800s, 1900s. He got interested in this whole idea of scrying and people seeing in stones and crystal balls and all of that. So he bought a crystal ball. And in a very unscientific experiment, he took his crystal ball and he handed it to a bunch of his friends and said, "Hey, what do you see?" And a whole bunch of them looked at the crystal ball and didn't see a darn thing. And one of the things he said is, if you look into a crystal ball, he said, if you try it 3 or 4 times and you never see pictures, you're never going to. Sorry, it just isn't going to work for you. He said, however, several of his friends, without any prompting, without being told what was supposed to happen, would look into this thing and they would see pictures. So it was working. The one that was really fascinating was a young girl, and he gave it to this young girl. The young girl looked at it, and what she saw was a paper with writing on it that was so real to her that she turned the ball over to see the paper on the other side. Okay? Now, how did she see the paper? Brain created it. What does that have to do with Joseph Smith? Well, in the discussion that Brother Brown was doing this morning, we were talking about Joseph's translation of the Papyrus of John. Several of the descriptions that we have of how Joseph translated talk about him seeing words on parchment. Where did it come from? Same place this girl saw paper. How does he see something on paper? The brain generates it. Where do the words come from? Well, the mentalese translates them. He gets language. The language is translated into something that he reads, and he sees the words that he writes, that he dictates to the scribe. So people say, well, did Joseph Smith read the translation? All the evidence says yes, absolutely, he saw it. The question then is, if he saw it, did he translate? Absolutely, the same way I translate from 2 different languages if I know them well. I understand it and I say it. He understood it and he gave it to us, and we have it in his language, therefore in his translation. So yes, he saw a translation. Yes, he translated. Same mechanism works. All right, last one. Maybe it's the last one. There we go. Here's the last thing that I was trying to do. What we've just been talking about in how does a sear stone work and how do you translate with a sear stone, I actually toyed with the idea of reading you 2 chapters, and I figured that would put you all asleep after dinner. So we didn't do that, but that's the information in them. There is a final chapter that says, now that we have a theory for how Joseph Smith translated, is that a productive theory? Can we use that theory to begin to explain the facets of the Book of Mormon that we see? Can we answer questions? And let me do 2 of them for you. Let's start with the hypothesis that the majority of the translation is a functional translation. One that, although it is an authentic translation of an ancient document, may not have the precise words that were on the document. I am guessing that there is a very large majority of people here who have not read Alan Christensen's translation of the Popol Vuh. I don't know why you haven't. I mean, surely everyone will. The Popol Vuh, for those who might not know, is a Quiche document. Quiche is a sufficiently different language that they use language in ways that don't translate very neatly into English. And so what Alan Christensen did was something absolutely wonderful for people like me that really want to get into this. He gave us 2 translations. He gave us a functional translation. He gave us a literal translation. You read the literal translation, you go, what? And then you read his other translation in nice, smooth English, and if you go between the 2, you can tell that he's telling the same story and getting the same information, but the sentences are dramatically different. The Quiche sentences are much smaller, tighter, and demonstrate a completely different understanding of literature and how you would turn a phrase and what the meaning might be. And they're both translations. The majority of the Book of Mormon reads like a functional translation. It's nice and it's smooth. Let's say that it was some language like Quiche. Doesn't read like that at all. It reads like English. It reads like the King James Bible. Why does it read like the King James Bible? It's a native language to Joseph. Of course that's what he's going to produce. It was Scripture. Anytime he produced Scripture, it sounded like the King James Bible because that's what Scripture was supposed to sound like. Again, information comes into the brain, comes out. Why functional? Because the mentalese that we use to store information is designed to handle the gist and not the words. It comes into a brain that is created in such a way that what we understand is meaning, not specific vocabulary. So of course he's got meaning, and of course in the translation of that meaning it's going to come out in whatever words Joseph Smith has to be able to communicate that meaning. And I suspect that a scholar of a different language might translate it a different way. Brigham Young said that if someone other than Joseph were to translate the Book of Mormon, he has no doubt that it would be materially different than the translation that we have. Well, of course, it was in Joseph's words. It was what he knew. Now, that tells us why the majority of it was that way. And I will confess that when I first started working on the project, I was pretty convinced that Joseph only translated one way, and I had to come up with an answer to how he translated. And then I started looking at the data, and the data proved me wrong. Data are funny things like that. And we have the names. Well, if everything's functional, how do you get a name? A name is a very different kind of animal and is stored in different structures in the brain. And names are not nouns. They are proper nouns, and we remember them that way. In fact, they're just finding out that there's now a cluster of things that all fire together, and if we think of a particular person, we think of this whole set of things. But still, the name is a specific thing. So when that fires, it is qualitatively different in the brain storage mechanism than these meanings, because it is a name, not a description. And so why is it that we get this literal translation of names that we can go from that name back to the subject? It's the way names are stored. Doesn't make any, it's not surprising at all that that's how we're going to get that information. So far, I've been able to go through questions about the translation and apply that theory and concept in ways that begin to answer facets of the text. That doesn't say that it's proof. When we were talking about this on one of the message boards, one of the brilliant anti-Mormons said, "Oh, do you mean you've got this great theory that you can't prove?" Yeah, you just can't prove historical theory. It just doesn't work. You can find out if it's productive and if it does something and if it answers questions, but there's no way to prove this. The only person who really could have told us how he did it was Joseph Smith, and I suspect that he did not understand fully how he did it either. But he did know one very, very important thing. He knew that he did not do it alone, so that when he was asked how he did it, the only competent answer he could give was that it was through the gift and power of God, and that is what we really need to know. Thank you. Now I have to put the glasses on. Could the various Book of Mormon authors have been permitted to read their own writings and convey their own mentalese to Joseph, who then rendered his English equivalent in the same mentalese? And might this explain stylometric differences in the English? I suppose so. Not sure that I see any particular evidence for that, and I'm not an expert in stylometry, and so I can't speak to it. We've got someone coming up tomorrow who is, and it is tomorrow, right? So that's probably a question that's much better for that person than for me. The vast majority from Mosiah until we get to the end of the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, all of that is in Mormon's hands, except for quotations. So unless you're really careful to pull out the quotation, we're getting Mormon most of the time anyway, and From my understanding of Mormon, he'd want to be there, the one that was telling, because he knew what he wanted to say in the first place. He knew why he selected that, not the person who wrote it. So, that personal opinion. Are you suggesting that the seer stone was unnecessary since it all happened in the brain? Why use the seer stone? Yeah. Technically, I am suggesting that the seer stone was not necessary, and here's the reason why. Eventually, Joseph learned not to use it. At the beginning, he did not know he could translate without it. He did not know he could receive inspiration without the seer stone. And once he had translated with it, he continued to use the translation to receive revelation. And there were some of the early members of the church that got unhappy with him because he stopped using the seer stone. They said, hey, if you're not receiving it through the seer stone, it's not real anymore. But here's the neat thing. When he stopped using it, he would give a revelation, and the revelation came in the exact description that people give of how he translated the Book of Mormon. No hesitation, no reading back or going. You read the descriptions of Joseph giving a revelation without the seer stone and Joseph translating with one, and they're exactly the same. At some point in time, Joseph learned that he was the seer, and so he was the one who was able to give the information. The seer stone was necessary to start him on the path. Think about Joseph Smith as a young man. He's get this plate, and God hands him the plates and says, hey, by the way, translate this. What? If God did that to me, you know what I do? I say, no, please, give it to somebody else. Give it to Kevin. Because he's better with the languages than. How do you do that? The only way he knew how to do it was with the talent that he had, that he knew he could touch something that someone else couldn't. And I believe firmly that Moroni had to help him make that transition from what he knew how to do before into how to translate. And then at some point in time, again, he learned that he was the seer and not the stone. Why did Joseph speak exact King James English, especially the Isaiah chapters? Isaiah's chapters are really fascinating because one of the things that you can be assured with in the Isaiah chapters is that Joseph was reading a page from the King James Version as he was doing it. Now, the problem with making that statement is he wasn't reading a page from the King James Version as he was doing it. Okay, you've got this wonderful contradiction. There's no evidence at all that he had a page there. There's no evidence that he had it. His head's stuck in a hat where there's no light. But all of the evidence says he was reading it, including the fact that he changed things where there were italics, which means you've got to see the italics to be able to do it. So how do you get that? Again, God has to tweak the right neurons. The page shows up, the words show on the page. All he had to have done is sometime in his life read Isaiah or skimmed over the page. The Lord could recall it for it, show it to him. He sees it there and reads it off. It's the same mechanism. The same thing. Discuss the lengthy sections just directly out of the KJV, or the KJV. Do you think this involves supernaturally enhanced recall? I don't think Joseph memorized it. I don't think his capacity to memorize textual pages was that good. I think that's more direct inspiration of the Lord, where the Lord says, okay, here's how we're going to do this one. I'll trigger whatever it is to call it up. So I still think it's through the gift and power of God and not some superhuman trait he had. What are the passages that you think are translated conceptually? I'll give you one of the two. Words of Mormon. Half of Words of Mormon reads exactly like it should read. It's a discussion that Mormon gives in there to say, okay, here it is, I've got these really cool plates that I found, and I'm going to put them in. Everything else in the text indicates that Mormon wanted those small plates to be included, but it really looks like he wanted them included as an appendix. There was no intention that they would be part of the main record, which is why he leaves them to his son to add on. Mormon wasn't going to do anything with them. He just thought they were cool, and we ought to pass them on. And the first half of that of Words of Mormon describes it. The second half of Words of Mormon is out of place. The second half introduces the book of Mosiah. And what it does is it covers the first 2 chapters of data that are missing because they were lost with the 116 pages. And if you don't know that history, you have no clue what's going on when you start Mosiah. And so we had to have it. I think that section, that last section that's discussing it, is a prophetic reinterpretation and retelling of the lost 2 chapters of Mosiah so that we have the information. I think it is based on the plates and based on information from the plates, inspired to give us the information that we need, but not translated directly from the plates, and would not be certainly even in the extent is not the same as what we would have lost. But I think that's one where reasonably you can look at it and say, okay, here's something that is an expansion of. My example also would be go to the book of Moses, where you know that what Joseph Smith was doing was looking at the book of Genesis, and all of a sudden we start off on this information that's not actually there in Genesis. Well, it's inspired translation, but not translation of a document, it's translation of information. And I think that's what's happening there. How does chiasmus fit in with your theory of translation? Structures work very nicely in this. There's all kinds of structural elements in the Book of Mormon. Because the structure of the language is not tied to the vocabulary of the language, you're going to be able to get structures. How do you get chiasms if they depend on the words? You're lucky when you get the same word. If you get the same meaning, it's going to pop through. So I think chiasmus comes through because of structures. There are lots of structural elements that come through because I think you can get the structure even if you use a different word than they might have used. I know I looked at the Psalm of Nephi, and I am convinced that there are tighter structures in there than Joseph managed to translate because he didn't see them and probably skipped over a couple. I think the actual plate text might have been more structured than what we actually have in English. Can you use your theory to explain the evolution of Joseph Smith's literary style? Only that everybody's style evolves and language evolves, and it's just part of the natural process. I mean, I don't think there's anything different in that than there would be in anybody else's evolution of a literary style. I think it's just part of what we do. What was the connection of Joseph's translation to the actual physical plates? 2 questions there. One, was he looking at them? No, all the evidence says they were off on the side and covered. So, is he staring at the plate and saying, this character must mean that? No, absolutely no evidence that that has occurred. Is there, however, evidence that the translation that we have in English has a relationship to the text that was on the plates? The only way of knowing that, failing the ability to have the text of the plates, is to be able to go through the Book of Mormon and compare it into cultural context so that you know that that is a book that was written anciently and not in modern times. Once you know that, then you can say, yes, it was a translation, and therefore it's translated whether he looked at the plates or not. Exactly how closely, that's kind of a judgment call, and I suspect some people are going to judge differently than I do. Did Moroni translate the 24 gold plates? I believe he abridged what Mosiah did. I don't see any indication that he did it again, and I see a lot of indication that what he did is interact with it and make his modifications as he was going through, but I think he used what was there. It would not even surprise me if he did it from memory rather than from an actual record. Just a guess. It says, an amazing book that covers the relationship between the subconscious mind and the conscious is Burton's On Being Certain, thinking that you're right. That's a book that I've been meaning to buy and I haven't yet. So I can't comment on it because I haven't read it yet, but I've seen it. Another one I was asking where we got the Isaiah passages. Can I address some of the questions on the screen? Yeah, buy the book. It's got more than that. Don't have enough time. I'm running out, right? Yeah, I'm running out. So, if God gives the information directly in the brain, why are sear stones or the crystal balls needed? Again, I think they were triggers. Joseph needed them to have the confidence, and other people to have the confidence. I mean, why would Martin Harris ever believe that Joseph Smith could translate? Why? And in fact, he didn't, which is why in one instance he takes the stone out to see if Joseph is really translating, which, by the way, I think is the Lord testing or proving something to Martin Harris and has nothing to do with Joseph Smith translating. I think that was an answer for Martin, not an answer for Joseph. That looks like pretty close to the same one we talked about. Our verses in the Book of Mormon that are somewhat awkward, yet evidence of ancient writing, evidence of a literal translation. I'd have to look at them to be able to say yes or no, but I think a lot of them are awkward because Joseph wasn't a really literate speaker of English. There are some things that are awkward because Joseph was awkward. Last one, we'll hurry. If the seer stone was the instrument to translate, did the gold plates need to be in the same room? No, they didn't. Having the gold plates let people know that there was something there, and again, it was a touchstone of faith for the people that were there to know that there was something real and tangible. It was something that allowed them to have something to hold on to that otherwise they would not have had. But the translation came through the gift and power of God, not Joseph's ability to see what a character was and know what its interpretation was. Thank you.